We're discussing the first public testimony of Rupert Murdoch since the UK phone hacking scandal really blew up with an article in The Guardian back on July the 4th. With us to talk about it from London, Tim Clement-Jones, spokesperson for the Liberal Democrats. France 24's Annette Young is with us. Also with us, Catherine Coron of the Sorbonne University's Center for Economic Research in Anglo-Saxon Countries, and Matthew Fraser, who teaches at the American University of Paris and the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Annette Young, those images of Rupert Murdoch being assaulted there by an activist during the hearing, that disrupted things a little.
It certainly did. And watching the tweets that came out as a result of that, someone said Rupert Murdoch just got face hacked, was one comic response. But and a lot of questions about security, given that it appears to be a sort of a plate full of shaving foam. So how did the young man in question managed to enter that room with an aerosol can of shaving foam, given the supposed high level of security? And even James Murdoch at the time was yelling out to the police who were guarding the panel members, what were you doing? How could you have allowed this to happen? So very dramatic events in a very dramatic hearing. I mean...
All right, and afterwards, Rupert Murdoch resuming with his jacket off. We were also mentioning before the break talking about the implications it'll have for the empire, Catherine Coron, and even comparing this hearing to the ones we've seen of some of the bankers over in the U.S. after the financial...
Greenspan, who is responsible? This is the question. And every time everybody's saying, not me. I had a part in this, but I'm not responsible.
Right, everyone expressing regret and no one taking responsibility. By the way, shares in News Corp have slid 18% since this story first broke. The Financial Times revealing this Tuesday that the Murdoch family's lost $1 billion in share value since that time. And there's still fuel in the tank, though. If you take a look at some of News Corp's worldwide holdings, an empire that first went global in 1969 with the purchase of The Sun and News of the World. And there you see just... Annette, you were talking a minute how it's a lot more than just newspapers. There you see some of the... It's quite staggering when you look at...
21st Century Fox or 20th... I don't know, have they updated to 21st Century or is it still 20th Century Fox? It's extraordinary.
HarperCollins publisher.
I mean, he owns 75% of Australian print media. He actually started out in my hometown, Adelaide. With
the Independent, by the way, this Tuesday, calling for James Murdoch to step down as chair of Sky B, and basically arguing, the paper denouncing the fact that he's both chairman and CEO, which is quite interesting because, Catherine Coron, that's common practice in France.
Right. But what is common practice? I would like to come back on the fact that, for me, Murdoch is a kind of symbol of entrepreneurship, of the kind of American type of American dream, somebody who self-made man, entrepreneur.
Even though he's Australian.
He's Australian.
Yes, but here I'm kind of trying to show that some British are doing it the same way than the Americans.
Well, in Murdoch's case, he came from a very wealthy family to begin with. He was educated at Geelong Grammar, which is the most exclusive school in Australia. His family, the Murdoch family, owned the Murdoch Press, which the Herald and Weekly Times. So he was already pretty well established, but he went out on his own. And as I said, he first bought the tabloid, The News.
Here's where the entrepreneur is coming and building something new, innovation. I mean, this is something positive, innovation, entrepreneurship. And here we have a kind of problem with this, with moralization. I mean, what he did, the way he operated.
It's the culture which allowed him to flourish. Yeah. That is the key thing about all this.
I've got to put the question to Tim Clement-Jones here. If there hadn't been the revelations concerning all of this, do you think that Sky B deal would have just been rubber stamped? What would have happened?
Well, we've all got different views about the B-Sky-B deal in terms of whether it would or would not have done anything about pluralism in our media. But what it allows us to do now is to go back to first principles, because the deal is not going ahead now. And it allows us to look at the plurality of the media afresh, and it allows us to look at whether the Murdoch empire, whether Murdoch himself and News Corp are fit and proper persons in terms of their right to have the holdings that they have in B-Sky-B in the first place. So there are quite a number of fundamental questions which now begin to open up as possibilities. I think the Jeremy Hunt proposals were probably, at that time, were the best that could be obtained, but they weren't particularly good, and nobody was particularly happy with further concentration. But that was better than a referral to the Competition Commission, because the Competition Commission didn't have the powers. So it's one of those sort of rather detailed and rather paradoxical situations. But I think that generally Mr. Rupert Murdoch's day is over, and I think having been, in a sense, a great entrepreneur in many ways, I mean, having, in a sense, instituted new technology in newspapers single-handed in terms of growing B-Sky-B in the way that he did, I think now it's all in reverse, and he's going to find that he has unleashed regulation of the print press in this country, which most people hadn't even envisaged at all just 6 months ago.
When you say all in reverse, should his empire be broken up?
Oh, I think the perception will be that Murdoch is no longer in control, and I thought that although James Murdoch gave a very polished performance, at the end of the day, even to the board of News Corp, who clearly are not a particularly critical bunch, I think they're going to be pretty reluctant to put a family member in place of Rupert Murdoch after this particular debacle. So I suspect that the Murdoch empire may be on the way out, quite honestly.
And is that your personal view, that it should be broken up?
I think that in terms of its power, clearly, I mean, I'm afraid my own party, probably because we're the third party, didn't have these kinds of relationships with the Murdoch press and News International and so on. But historically, Labour and Conservative prime ministers have had far too cosy a relationship with the News International group, which has had far too many titles, far too much influence over broadcast and print in the UK over many, many years. And in fact, the last Communications Act was amended by Labour to benefit the Murdoch empire so that he could own more newspapers, which, I mean, is an extraordinary fact.
Matthew Fraser, you think back, point taken there, 1995, Tony Blair flies to Australia to cement his relationship with Rupert Murdoch. It's not just the Conservatives.
Every party in power has been currying favor with him. Rebecca Brooks was close to Labour before she was close to David Cameron. This is a woman who was able to swagger in London society, knowing that she not only had friends in high places, but she was protected, or the organisation was protected by the police. There was a story in The Guardian, I think 2 days ago, recounting how David Cameron had wanted to hire a BBC reporter as his press secretary, and Rebecca Brooks vetoed that decision and insisted that it was Andy Coulson from News International. In other words, her influence with the Prime Minister was so great that she could actually plant people in his office and say, "No, David, I'd like you to take my friend." I mean, that's extraordinary power of the press. Infiltrating politics at the highest level.
And that will be the undoing of David Cameron, I suspect, is indeed that fateful appointment of Andy Coulson, which to this day he still refuses to apologise for.
He refuses to apologise for it, and what's interesting is that on the front pages this Tuesday of the newspapers, obviously there was the story that broke Monday of the News of the World whistleblowing journalist Sean Hoare. No foul play suspected there. But the papers also have fresh revelations about Rebecca Brooks attending David Cameron's birthday party in October. This after a secret December 23rd family dinner with Brooks and James Murdoch.
Well, her husband is a very old close friend of David Cameron's from Eton. I mean, they're very tight. They're close friends.
They're all part of the Chipping Norton set, which is this group of people who live out in Oxfordshire, and they're all, heading over to one another's for weekends and dinner parties and so on. Again, it reveals the very cosy and close media ties with politicians in the UK, and it was interesting to see Rupert Murdoch talk about this during today's testimony, in which he says that within days of David Cameron winning the election, he was ushered through the back door, mind you, of 10 Downing Street and offered a cup of tea and thanks for his support. He then very quickly went on to say that he'd been there many times before, including Gordon Brown.
And that he wished he could rebuild his relationship with Brown. There was a lead editorial, by the way, in the same Daily Telegraph, which says of Cameron, he's not been frank with the public about his own relationship with News International executives and Mrs. Brooks in particular. A full account of his social engagements with Mrs. Brooks and other News International executives is required. It might help to explain why he appointed Mr. Coulson in the first place, a fateful decision that lies at the root of the difficulties he faces. When you look, Tim Clement-Jones, at bookmakers' odds of David Cameron resigning go down and down and down, would you say that it now is a legitimate question?
It's a legitimate question, but I don't think the answer is that he could or should or should go. I think Wednesday's debate, I mean, he has questions to answer. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But I don't think there's any great public taste to see Cameron go. And frankly, what he's guilty of is pretty much what every Prime Minister before him, apart from John Major, to his credit, is guilty of, which is cozying up to the press, taking on somebody recommended by News International to be his press officer at Downing Street, and so on and so forth. Now, that may display a lack of judgment, but it's that kind of lack of judgment about relationships with the Murdoch press and with the press generally, which have characterised every British Prime Minister bar one.
Yes, but there's one big difference. He's the first Prime Minister to have a scandal of this magnitude explode in his face. I think he's in serious trouble. He has to come back in damage control mode tomorrow. Clearly, he has very tough questions to answer. His relationship with Rebekah Brooks, which you just raised, hiring Andy Coulson, which is another one. He's in a tight spot. It's difficult to see how he can explain these things.
And I think also these revelations are not going to end today. They're going to continue. It's going to be a drip-by-drip scenario, and it's going to erode public confidence. So one wonders, 3 to 6 months down the track from where we are now, where will David Cameron be? What sort of level of support will he have with the British electorate?
And how could Labour exploit that to their advantage, really?
Well, yeah, but the point is that you've seen the opinion polls, you've seen the public reaction over the last week or two to even what his own party think has been a good performance by Ed Miliband. They've actually been left rather cold by a lot of this. Miliband's ratings in public terms haven't improved. And so I'm not sure the public, strangely enough, is treating this as important, as an important an issue as Westminster is.
Interesting you should say that, Tim Clement-Jones. I just want to show some of the reactions we've been getting from viewers. First of all, on Twitter. Should Cameron resign, we asked. Well, Arun answers, what for? What's he charged for? No criminal offences. Also, the Deputy Labour leader last night said opposition is not calling on him to resign. On Facebook, Pascal from Netanya in Israel writes, no way. People can socialize without being corrupted, can't they? It's about time the media tell their audience this. Breaking news with more and more headlines of suspicion puts democracy at stake. While Honey writes that Cameron will have to go, period. You can't have 2 senior policemen resigning from Scotland Yard because they had connection to a former News of the World employee and expect Cameron, who hired Coulson against everybody warning him not to, being allowed to get away with it. Vive la révolution anglaise. And Eric finally writes, I think France 24's question about should Cameron resign be modified. Can Cameron still be an effective Prime Minister after his administration's been damaged from this scandal? If not, for the good of his party in the UK, should step aside. However, if he can somehow turn this into a watershed moment for the UK and also pursue the agenda he was elected to do, then he should stay, says Eric. So we will indeed be watching what happens when the Prime Minister speaks on Wednesday. Interesting to hear the words of the former Deputy Prime Minister from Labour, John Prescott, when asked about David Cameron's fortunes or misfortunes, had this to say.
If his judgment's lousy on Coulson, you've got to wonder our Prime Minister's judgment on other things, haven't you? And particularly when all this came out, he's still whining and dining the Murdoch press and putting him in his house, you know, the state home of Chequers. This man's deep into the relationship, for which he just condemned, really, the Commissioner.
Tim Clement-Jones, is that a fair point on the part of John Prescott?
It's a fair point to make about any politician, and you could make that point about John Prescott's career in spades. He's the guy who's punched members of the public. He's the guy who's had numerous affairs with his secretary and others. I mean, you know, it is laughable, really, when I listen to what John Prescott had to say.
So for the Liberal Democrats, in any case, they're not going to abandon ship at this point.
We're certainly not going to abandon ship. Of course, we've got proposals to make. Nick Clegg's already made it very clear where we stand in terms of wanting to increase the level of regulation over the print media, changing the Press Complaints Commission, and you know, many other areas that need examination. We were the ones who really, in a sense, shaped the nature of the inquiry taking place by Lord Leveson, and so you know, we've got a considerable influence in all of this. But you know, we do not believe that this is a resigning matter for David Cameron. Of course, we believe that he needs to have a very effective performance tomorrow, but that is a very different question. As many of your Twitter correspondents have said, very different issue to asking him to resign.
Final point, Annette Young, because we're almost out of time here. There's going to be a rethink of the relationship between politicians and the media as a result of this. What's it going to mean for freedom of the press?
Well, this is the big issue and press regulation. Of course, there's been a lot of debate now, and I was listening to BBC Radio 4 this morning, where already there's much concern among journalists that this will be greater regulation of the print media as such, and that it is a worry, particularly in the UK, because newspapers are partisan, unlike Australia, where by and large they're supposedly, you know, impartial as such. And as a result, you know, could we see a greater regulation, a regulatory authority being put into place and thus restricting freedom of speech, therefore?
I think that's an important question, and one that we've tend to overlook. That is, it's basically bad news for journalists, right? I mean, Murdoch has lost a lot of credibility, but for mainstream old media newspaper journalists, it's bad news because the public will have less and less confidence in journalists. Already they have a very low level of confidence, and secondly, newspapers financially are in very, very bad shape at the moment. So it's very bad news for Rupert Murdoch. It's bad news for British journalism, but it's bad news for journalism in general.
Press,
yes, yeah.
Can I just point out one thing?
Very briefly, because we're out of time.
The Guardian, let's not forget, it was the print media who broke this story.
True.
All right, and we'll continue to follow it. Annette Young, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Matthew Fraser for joining us, Catherine Coron, and Tim Clement-Jones for joining us from London. We want to thank you for being with us for the France 24 debate. Well, there'll be much more on the fortunes and misfortunes of Rupert Murdoch in business. That's next with Marcus Carlson.
He's probably the best-known jazz pianist alive, a child prodigy who went on to become one of the most revolutionary figures in music. Join me as I meet the legend Herbie Hancock.
Don't miss Culture, Thursday, 5:15 p.m. Paris time on France 24.
Cosmic competition. In Beyond Business, we look at how satellite images have become a treasure trove of information for farmers, oil companies and mining firms. We look at a multi-billion-euro market known as geoinformation.
Don't miss Beyond Business, Saturday, 10:15 a.m. Paris time on France 24.